So, how do you build a nation over the span of 2,000 years? Today on The Explainer, we're unpacking the absolutely epic story of France. A journey from scattered tribes to a global power, a story built through conquest, revolution, and just constant reinvention. The story of France isn't really about simple lines on a map. It's this constant, and often violent, process of breaking down, rebuilding, and reinventing itself. It's a journey from this fragmented land into a fiercely centralized state, and then a long struggle to figure out what comes next. Okay, so let's dive in right at the beginning. First up, let's look at the raw materials. We're talking about a land that wasn't even France yet, just a patchwork of tribes and provinces. This was the foundation that everything else was going to be built on. The foundations of France were basically laid down in these huge layers of conquest. First, you've got the Celtic Gauls, and they get absorbed by the Roman Empire, which creates this unique Gallo-Roman culture. Then, the Germanic Franks show up under their king Clovis. And finally, after the great Charlemagne's empire splits apart, the western chunk, West Francia, emerges. That's the real kernel of the nation we know today. Okay, so we have this fragmented kingdom. How in the world was it painstakingly forged into a single powerful state where all the power flowed right to the king? For centuries, the French kings played the long game. I mean, a really long game. Starting way back in 987, they just relentlessly worked to centralize power. Generation by generation, they slowly chipped away at the authority of these regional lords and barons who were basically ruling their own little kingdoms and pulled all that power toward the crown in Paris. And a huge catalyst for this whole process was the brutal century-long war against England. The Hundred Years' War, it was a total game changer. It transformed what started as a feudal squabble over land into a truly national struggle. For the very first time, people started to see themselves not just as, subjects of some local duke, but as French. And of course, the most famous symbol of that new identity was the national heroine Joan of Arc. This whole process really hit its peak with one man, Louis XIV, the Sun King. He was an absolute master of political theater. He completely subjugated the powerful nobles by forcing them to live under his thumb at the ridiculously lavish Palace of Versailles. He cemented the idea that the king's will was the law. The state, that's me, period. But here's the thing about that kind of absolute power. It creates a system that's like a pressure cooker, just waiting to explode. The next phase of our story is that explosion, the Great Rupture, the moment the monarchy was violently shattered and replaced with something totally new. By the late 1700s, French society, the so-called Old Order, was just dangerously top-heavy. I mean, just look at these numbers. They're insane. You've got 97% of the population, the third estate, shouldering the entire tax burden. And who were they supporting? A tiny, tax-free elite. You just can't sustain a system like that. It was a ticking time bomb. And so, with the country broke and people desperate, it finally blew. The people erupted. And the fall of the Bastille prison in Paris, this huge symbol of royal power, became the spark that lit the fuse of the French Revolution. And honestly, it was a moment that changed the world forever. What followed, though, was a period of extreme radicalism and a whole lot of bloodshed. The monarchy was abolished, the king and queen were executed, and the revolutionaries tried to erase every single trace of the old way of life, sending thousands to the guillotine, all in the name of the Republic. Then, out of all this chaos, emerges this one figure, Napoleon Bonaparte. He seizes power and, get this, declares himself emperor, which is pretty ironic, right? But here's the great twist of history. Even as an autocrat, he locked in many of the revolution's core ideas. His Napoleonic Code abolished feudalism and established legal equality, a framework that would spread all across Europe. So, after Napoleon's final defeat in 1815, France enters this really dizzying period of political instability. They had successfully torn down the old system, but now they had to figure out, what do we replace it with? What followed was just a century of political whiplash. Seriously, in just over 50 years, the country cycles through a restored monarchy, then another monarchy, then a republic, then an empire under Napoleon's nephew, and then finally another republic. It was like they were just desperately trying on different forms of government to see what would stick. Finally, as we get into the 20th century, a lasting republic is forged. But it was about to be tested like never before by the most destructive wars in all of human history. France just endured two devastating world wars. In World War I, it suffered these unbelievable human and economic losses, with much of the war fought right on its own soil. Then, in the Second World War, it faced the utter humiliation of being conquered and occupied, which led to the dark chapter of the collaborationist Vichy government, but also the heroic resistance of the Free French. And yet, somehow, from those absolute ruins, a remarkable recovery began. It was powered by a post-war baby boom and what the French call les 30 glorieuses, the 30 glorious years of incredible economic growth, modernization, and rising standards of living. At the very same time, though, the nation was grappling with the painful and often violent process of taking apart its colonial empire. These draining wars in Indochina, and especially in Algeria, deeply divided the country and fundamentally reshaped French society. So after coming through this incredibly tumultuous century, France really solidifies its position as a major global power. It secures a permanent seat on the UN Security Council, develops its own nuclear weapons, and becomes a central architect of what we now know as European Union. So when you step back and look at the whole picture, from Celtic territory to Roman province, from absolute monarchy to modern republic, France's identity has been forged through constant, radical transformation. So after 2,000 years of reinvention, the question isn't just what France will become next, but how it will reconcile its powerful, complicated history with the challenges of a whole new global era.